The first $10,000 a month is not really a money milestone. It is a truth milestone. That is what most people do not understand. They think a $10,000 month means comfort or status or proof that the world has finally recognized their talent. Sometimes it brings a little of that. What it really brings is exposure. It exposes whether you have become the kind of person who can create income on purpose, or whether you merely got lucky in a moment and are about to lose the thread. I have spent most of my life around money, and one lesson has only become clearer with age. The world rewards structure much more consistently than it rewards intention. A great many people want more. Very few are willing to become shaped around the thing they say they want. They want the bigger income. They do not want the narrower year. They want the freedom. They do not want the boredom, repetition, rejection, and private embarrassment that usually come first. They want the machine. They do not want to spend a year building gears. That is why so many stay in the same life longer than they need to. Not because life gave them no opening, because when the opening demanded concentration, humility, and daily repetition, they called it unreasonable and went back to wanting the outcome more than the process. The source material you gave me has a very strong instinct here. It says that if a person wants to change his financial life quickly, he has to treat 1 year differently from the rest. He has to make one primary objective outrank nearly everything else that does not create money, build a skill, or protect health. It also says that a lot of what separates the people who break out from the people who stay where they are is embarrassment tolerance. That is unusually good advice, because a year of financial acceleration is not a normal year. It is a war year. I do not mean panic. I mean order in war. Luxuries get examined, distractions get exposed, vagueness gets punished. In ordinary life, a person can hide in busyness. He can say he has a lot going on. He can confuse motion for direction. He can tell himself he is trying. In a war year, none of that counts. Everything asks the same question: does this move money, build the engine that moves money, or keep the body and mind usable enough to continue? If not, it is probably a distraction. That is a severe sentence. It is also a useful one. I once knew a young man who believed he lacked opportunity. He did not. He lacked a hard ranking of priorities. Every week he was busy. Every month he was tired. Every quarter he was disappointed. He worked, he scrolled, he talked, he watched, he planned, he bought small comforts. He took small breaks to recover from a life that was producing nothing worth recovering into. When he looked at other people who were pulling away, he thought they must have had a better start. No, many of them had a narrower year. That is what he could not see. A narrower year is one of the most underrated assets in the world. A year where the social life shrinks. A year where vanity spending gets cut. A year where spare hours are recaptured and handed to the future, instead of to entertainment disguised as recovery. A year where the scoreboard becomes simple enough that denial cannot survive. The original framework says to write down a single scoreboard metric and build everything around it. It even suggests a concrete target of reaching a $10,000 month by the end of the year. I like that very much, not because the exact number is sacred, because a clear number forces a clear life. The public likes vague ambition because vague ambition protects the ego. I want to do better. I want more money. I want freedom. Those sentences are emotionally satisfying and economically useless. A true target is awkward. It demands a calendar. It demands arithmetic. It demands the embarrassment of realizing what your current actions would actually produce if repeated honestly for another 12 months. A man who says, by December I want my first $10,000 month, has given himself something valuable. He has given himself a ruler. Now the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly must I become for that to happen? That is the real question. Not what app to download, not what guru to admire, not what perfect niche to fantasize about. Who must I become? Because the identity does. If a person is still organized like a spectator, he will stay paid like one. If he is still arranged like a consumer, the first extra money will get consumed. If he is still emotionally dependent on approval, the first months of rejection will send him back into hiding. That is why I always say the early stage of wealth building is much more psychological than the public realizes. People think the first obstacle is a business model. Usually the first obstacle is tolerance. Tolerance for looking unimportant while you are still becoming useful. Tolerance for having no visible proof for a while. Tolerance for being ignored. Tolerance for asking for money before you fully feel ready. Tolerance for repetition. Tolerance for your own crudeness at the beginning. The source text describes this very bluntly. It says you will feel cringe, you will be ignored. People may laugh, and that if you can tolerate looking stupid for a year, you can look successful for a lifetime. That sentence contains more truth than many business books. The world thinks confidence is the opposite of shame. Very often, confidence is simply the ability to continue while shame is still in the room. That is the first thing I would want a person to understand. The second is this: do not start with inspiration. Start with fundamentals. The original framework tells the reader to buy books, study the basics, and stop behaving like someone who can skip the foundation because he is already clever. That is wise. The arrogant poor man is one of the saddest figures in finance. He thinks he is too special for basics, too intuitive for discipline, too energetic for study. He wants tactics before principles, volume before process. Revenue before competence. The market is not kind to that kind of ego. A person who wants to build real income in a short window must first stop acting as though fundamentals are beneath him. He must understand selling. He must understand offers. He must understand why some businesses scale while others turn into exhausting jobs. He must understand habit formation because a year is too long to be carried by mood. That is why I have always liked reading when reading becomes operational. Not reading for the feeling of self-improvement, reading for implementation. The original framework names books that represent the right categories: leverage volume systems, offer construction, lead generation, behavioral consistency. Those are the right categories. A person who understands those categories is already standing in a different financial world than someone who is still hoping desire alone will produce structure. Now, after priorities and foundations come the tools. The original piece asks the reader to make an inventory of the tools and skills already available. Laptop, phone, camera, editing ability, design ability, writing ability, anything that can be turned into a marketable function. Then it says to pick a money skill, not a passion. That is one of the sharpest distinctions in the whole piece. A money skill is not necessarily the thing you most enjoy. It is the thing the market reliably pays for because it solves a costly problem. Sales, copywriting, media, buying, video editing, appointment setting, automation, design tied to revenue. Closing. These are not beautiful words in the poetic sense. They are beautiful in the economic sense. They sit near money. That matters. The market is constantly teaching a hard lesson that many people resist for years. Value is not what you find impressive. Value is what other people will pay to have solved. A money skill sits close enough to pain, urgency, revenue, or conversion that the buyer can justify payment without needing to be entertained by your self-image. That is why I prefer these kinds of skills for early acceleration. They pay weekly. They create proof quickly. They expose you to the language of outcomes. And outcomes are what adults buy, not effort, not potential, outcomes. I want to dwell on that for a moment because it changes everything. Children are praised for effort. Adults are paid for results. There is nothing unfair about that. It is just expensive when misunderstood. A person can work very hard on something nobody wants and remain broke with great sincerity. A person can work on something unglamorous that a buyer urgently values and get rich faster than the romantic worker who still wants to be rewarded for trying. This is why I have always thought the market was less moral than people want and more useful than they admit. It does not care whether the task is boring. It cares whether the task matters. Once a person chooses a skill that matters, the next step becomes obvious. Practice must become daily and real. The source material is correct to say that practice does not mean merely watching more content about the skill. It means doing it, replicating what works, and putting in at least an hour every day, even when there is no mood for it. That is exactly the difference between someone who is into a skill and someone who is becoming expensive with it. Repetition has a brutal honesty to it. It strips away fantasy. A person who edits every day stops romanticizing editing. He starts seeing pacing, structure, tension, timing, transitions, client preferences, and all the ways a deliverable actually earns its keep. A person who makes sales calls every day stops talking about sales as a personal brand and starts understanding objections, urgency, follow-up tone, cadence, and the point at which a buyer either trusts you or closes the mental door. Skill only begins paying serious money once it has become practical enough that another person can feel its effect. That takes reps always. The person begins to outgrow his environment. The original framework says not to tell your inner circle what you are doing, because most of them are limited by who they already know you to be. It says to move in silence not because you are mysterious, but because you are fragile. This is psychologically very astute. Beginnings are fragile. People think protection means encouragement. It often does not. Often it means fewer opinions, fewer conversations, fewer invitations to explain yourself before results exist. The seed is not weak because it requires shelter. It is simply early. And early things do not benefit from being trampled by people whose worldview would be threatened if you changed faster than they expect. That is why I have always told people to be careful where they seek advice. Never take advice from someone whose life you would not trade for. That is not arrogance. That is filtration. The wrong advice does not merely waste time. It can push a person back into a normal life right when he was finally beginning to build something abnormal. Now let us turn to proximity. The source text says to get closer to money physically, mentally, and practically. It says to go to events, watch mentors, enter environments where competence is visible, and pay for feedback rather than fantasy. That is profoundly important. Money is not just arithmetic. It is environment. A person who lives only in rooms where nobody is building, selling, negotiating, scaling, or talking in terms of outcomes will unconsciously inherit the expectations of those rooms. He may still be hardworking. He may still be intelligent. He will likely remain financially provincial. You learn different things when you get near people who are closer to capital. You see how they speak, how quickly they decide, how they frame value, how they handle objections, how they use standards instead of emotion, how they ask for money without apologizing for existing. That kind of learning is worth an enormous amount. The source text also says something that I think is even more valuable than expensive courses. Pay for faster learning and correction. Exactly. Beginners spend far too much time trying to save money on correction while happily wasting months on confusion. A good piece of feedback at the right moment. Now comes a place where most people finally touch reality. The first sale, the source text says, to race to proof and make $100 from a stranger, even if the process of learning costs you $100. It says the first real win is when someone you have never met buys from you. That is one of the strongest ideas in the whole framework. Until a stranger pays, you have hope. After a stranger pays, you have evidence. Not because $100 is a fortune, because the market has now answered your existence. A stranger had no emotional obligation to protect your self-esteem. A stranger exchanged money for what you offered. That is a different category of truth. I have always liked first proof because it strips the beginner of his main excuse. Once someone paid, the mechanism is possible. Now, the task is not wondering whether this can work in the universe. The task is making it repeatable. And repeatability is the whole game. This is why documentation matters. The source text says to document what you did, build proof of ability, collect testimonials, and turn the result into something visible online. Correct. People do not buy promises. They buy reduced uncertainty. Proof reduces uncertainty. That is why before and after examples work. That is why testimonials work. That is why case studies work. That is why the person with receipts gets paid differently than the person with passion. The public loves passion. The buyer loves proof. Now, once there is proof, the next bottleneck appears: distribution. The source text says that once you have something people will pay for, getting rich fast becomes mostly about distribution, not skill. It urges the reader to pick one distribution channel, become loud there daily, and prioritize promotion before fulfillment. That is a severe sentence and an important one. A lot of talented people remain broke because they still think doing the work is the hierarchy. It is not. Getting clients is the hierarchy. If no one knows you exist, skill becomes a private hobby. If the pipeline is weak, the business is weak no matter how talented the operator is. This is another adult truth the public resists. Business is not paid for effort. It is paid for delivered outcomes sold into a market through functioning distribution. That is why I would rather have one decent skill with consistent distribution than a spectacular hidden talent trapped in obscurity. One channel, one message. 1 year, that is enough. The source text is right that most people fail because they try to do every platform badly instead of one platform. Seriously, specificity beats scattered energy almost every time. Then, eventually, the wonderful and dangerous thing happens. Demand outruns your own hours. Most people think this is the finish line. It is not. It is a new test, because now you must decide whether you are. The source text says that when you have more clients than you can handle, you hire for the boring, repeatable part, keep the client relationship, problem solving, and money handling yourself, and let contractors carry the time, consuming load. It also says hiring should create at least 3 times the value it costs. That is operationally wise. Hiring does not fix weakness. It scales it. A broken process with more people becomes a bigger broken process. A strong process with a good hire becomes leverage. This is why I like simple delegation first. Not a grand org chart. Not ego hires. Not titles for self. Importance. Time recovery. Anything repetitive enough to write down clearly is a candidate. That is how the owner protects his highest value hours for sales, quality, recruiting, and problem solving. Once that happens, pricing matters. The source text goes into anchoring, tiers, higher ticket offers, premium positioning, and avoiding custom work traps, where everything depends on you saying yes to one off requests. This is excellent, because price is not only a revenue decision, it is a systems decision. The wrong pricing model forces a business to stay noisy in labor. Heavy, the right pricing model allows standardization, margin, expectation management, and the beginning of machine, like behavior. This is what I mean when I say the person is no longer selling hustle. He is selling reliability. Reliability is one of the most profitable qualities in business because buyers are tired. They want safety. They want standards. They want to know what they get when they get it, and what happens if things drift. The adult who can provide that gets paid more, not because he is loud, but because he reduces friction, and friction is expensive. Now we come to the part where many people destroy themselves. They start making money and assume the money is theirs. The source text says not to take money out too early, to keep the grind going, to live below your means on purpose, even while revenue grows, and to think of cash as oxygen for the business. That is exactly right. Revenue is not yet wealth. Revenue is fuel. If you remove too much fuel too early, the engine stays small. The public does this constantly. They get their first profitable months and immediately begin rewarding themselves like survivors. The better apartment, the status purchases, the trip, the expensive little freedoms that make them feel as though the suffering phase is finally over. Then growth stalls because they spent the machine's oxygen. That is a terrible trade. I prefer reinvestment. The source text describes 4 buckets: tools that increase output, gear that increases quality, people that increase capacity, education that removes bottlenecks faster. Those are exactly the right buckets. Money should buy speed, capacity, quality, and certainty before it buys applause. Applause does not compound. Systems do. Once the system starts working, the really interesting lesson appears. You begin to see how whales make money. The source text says to study the bigger players in your field and ask what they are really doing differently. It identifies leverage, ownership, distribution, compounding, and reputation as the major money patterns and says rich people ask where value is created and who owns it. That is the mature question. Not how do I copy the outer appearance? Where is the value really created? Who controls the customer relationship? Who owns the distribution? Who owns the recurring revenue? Who gets a share of upside when performance improves? Who gets paid once and who keeps getting paid? That is how adults read a business. And once you start reading that way, you stop chasing novelty. You evolve what already works. You add recurring plans. You add premium tiers. You negotiate performance components. You engineer referrals. You move from doing the work to owning more of the economics around the work. That is the whole maturation process. The source text says success becomes a question of volume and manufacturing, not inspiration. It says to stop experimenting like a beginner once you know what works, and to focus on the 20% of actions creating the majority of outcomes. Exactly. This is the stage where the person stops acting like a creative child and starts acting like an operator. That transition is what people call getting serious, and it is why most overnight successes took years. The source text ends with a realistic timeline that I think is one of its smartest parts. It says money starts showing up toward the end of the first year. Real traction often takes around 3 years. Public-looking success takes closer to 7. And durable substance can take 10 or more. That is probably closer to truth than most motivational content ever gets. The world is full of people trying to escape the timeline instead of using it. The only serious question is whether you are building something while it passes. If you compress 1 year hard enough, you can change the direction. If you stay with it long enough, you can change the category of your life. That is what this whole framework is really about. Not $10,000 a month by itself. That is only the first clean proof that you are no longer fully trapped in the old life. The real prize is different. Control, the day when your earning ability is no longer capped by what some employer thinks you are worth. The day when your pipeline is yours. The day when your systems are yours. The day when 1 month of strong execution can produce more than a year of drifting ever did. The day when you are no longer selling labor alone. That is what I would want any ambitious person to understand. A breakthrough year is not made of hype. It is made of narrow priorities. Daily reps, proof distribution, standardization, reinvestment, and volume. Nothing romantic, nothing mysterious. Just structure repeated, until the market finally has to respond. That is how people pull away quietly at first. Then obviously, and once the machine starts helping, the whole world begins calling it talent. Often it was structure all along. There is one more reason this framework matters. It is not just about making more money. It is about changing your relationship with uncertainty. A person who lives only on wages lives in a fragile emotional world. Even if the wages are decent, even if the title sounds respectable, he still wakes up knowing that the machine supporting his life is not his. The calendar is not his. The pipeline is not his. The customers are not his. The systems are not his. The upside is not really his. He rents his position in a structure someone else owns. That is normal. It is also psychologically costly. It means every company announcement has more power over him than it should. Every reorganization, every management change, every budget cut, every whim from people he did not choose. When a person starts building even a small independent machine, that psychological climate begins to change. He stops asking only what they will do. He starts asking what he can build. That shift matters more than the public realizes, because people do not only get richer when they build a machine, they become mentally stronger, they become harder to scare, harder to impress, harder to control. The original framework hints at this without saying it directly. It says that once you reach the later steps, you are no longer a slave and you begin controlling your own financial destiny. That sounds dramatic, but beneath the drama is a very sober truth. Control is one of the highest value financial assets in the world. Not total control, of course. No one gets that. But more control over cash flow, more control over who you serve, more control over your schedule, more control over whether growth goes to your life or to an employer's valuation. That is a real upgrade in the quality of being alive. And one reason I think this matters so much is that the public is full of people who want entrepreneurial rewards without entrepreneurial reordering. They want speed without narrowing the year. They want freedom without accepting repetition. They want leverage without first becoming worth listening to, worth buying from, or worth referring. That is fantasy. The market is harsh toward fantasy. A useful person with a repeatable offer, visible proof, and a functioning distribution channel is not playing a fantasy game anymore. He is playing arithmetic. That is why I respect arithmetic so much. Arithmetic is clean. You made the calls or you did not. You built the offer or you did not. You collected proof or you did not. You standardized the process or you did not. You reinvested or you celebrated too early. You studied how bigger operators win or you stayed impressed by surfaces. Those are not mystical questions. They are managerial questions. And management is what usually separates the person with a temporary spike from the person building a durable machine. I also want to say something about pride. Pride is expensive in the first year. The source text is right when it says people often have to do work that feels beneath them. That sentence cuts deep because it collides directly with modern identity. People want to begin at the level of they want to skip the humble beginning. They want the beautiful brand, the polished website, the perfectly defined niche, the flawless confidence. Very often, what gets a person moving is something much less glamorous. A basic offer, an ugly first landing page, a simple contract, a modest first client, an imperfect service, a direct message sent with trembling hands. The market does not mind humble beginnings nearly as much as the ego does. It is the ego that says this is beneath me. Reality says get paid first, then improve. That is a much healthier philosophy. Get paid first, then improve. That is how adults build. The person who waits for perfect readiness is often a spectator with higher standards for fantasy than for action. The person who is willing to begin rough but useful learns things the spectator never will. Proof, buyer psychology, pricing tolerance, client pain, delivery friction, none of that can be learned in a purely theoretical way. It must be touched. That is why I like the source tech's insistence on getting to $100 from a stranger as fast as possible. One honest dollar from the market teaches more than a month of self-esteem. And then, once you have touched proof, the hierarchy becomes obvious. Protect health. Protect focus. Practice the revenue skill. Create proof. Make yourself findable. Sell daily. Document everything. Delegate repetitive load. Raise standards. Raise price when certainty rises. Reinvest like the machine still needs oxygen. Study how larger operators make their money, then pour volume into what already works. That is the ladder. And the beautiful thing about a ladder is that it removes confusion. You do not need 10 identities. You do not need 10 projects. You do not need 10 theories about your future. You need one climb. That is why a compressed year can be so valuable. Not because it turns you into a superhero, because it stops the leakage of self-division. A divided year rarely changes a life. A concentrated one often does. So if I had to summarize the whole thing in the language I trust most, I would say it this way. A person gets rich fast only after he has spent enough time being organized in a way almost no one around him finds attractive. He narrows his life, he studies fundamentals, he picks a skill near money. He practices until proof appears. He gets close to competence. He protects the fragile beginning from the wrong voices. He makes a stranger pay. He documents proof. He builds one channel of distribution seriously. He delegates time sinks. He stops selling hustle and starts selling reliability. He reinvests before he celebrates. He studies how bigger players own the economics. He repeats what works with more volume and less drama. That is the path. Not mystical, not elegant in the beginning, not comfortable, but real. And reality, when repeated daily, is much more powerful than inspiration. That is what I would want someone to remember if he truly wanted the next year to matter. Not that the money is easy, that the machine is buildable, and once the machine is built, the money stops feeling mysterious. It begins behaving like the natural consequence of a structure that was finally aligned with outcomes.